Don't test tiny things. Don't test small sample sizes, right? Test things where you have the biggest lever. So if I can move the needle on revenue or signups or, whatever that, key metric is, do that first and focus on it and make it better, because every time you push it a little bit more, it's going to compound and ultimately result in net conversion funnel differences that impact your business.
Hello, everyone. You are listening to the Data Unlocked podcast. In this podcast, we explore the ways in which data drives creativity and innovation for marketers, and we explore that with the best and brightest in the industry. My name is Jason Davis, founder and CEO of Simon Data, a growth platform driving smarter marketing for brands like JetBlue, TripAdvisor, Equinox, and BarkBox. I'm excited to have our guest, Ryan Koonce, on our podcast here today. Ryan is CEO of Mammoth Growth. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Jason, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. And so maybe to kick off, if you could maybe just tell our listeners a little bit about Mammoth Growth and what you guys do.
Yeah, definitely. We're a 7-ish-year-old data analytics consultancy, and we help clients really get to accurate, reliable, consistent data across their stack and do something with it. And those things tend to be, more revenue for more customers more often at a lower cost.
Great. And so maybe we'll sort of kick off here. Ryan, you and I were talking before, over the last few weeks, really, and we've been partners now for quite some time. And really, at the end of the day, the ultimate goal that Simon Data affects as a platform is one of driving that next generation of data-driven marketing. But really, when you unpack these problems, and for every marketer who's aspiring to affect better personalization, better cross-channel coordination, deeper segmentation, and it really just at the end of the day, better articulation of your value proposition, through a data-driven approach. These problems are actually much bigger than just technology problems. And the big question today, that we wanted to discuss is really just issues around how people, how organizational structures, and how strategy really just play a critical role and in many ways a starting point, to make sure that that your marketing team and your customer-facing teams are fully enabled, to be data-driven, to leverage the power of today's data infrastructure and first-party data. Obviously, I'll talk about some of the challenges for a moment from a technology perspective. When we sort of look at everything that's exploded, from a technology perspective around the modern data warehouse, around the modern data stack, and around explosions in data volumes. I think last year, the number of terabytes or petabytes or exabytes or whatever it is, that are stored in today's cloud data warehouse, increased by 53%. And over $30 billion were poured into data infrastructure. So, there's certainly no deficit, for data from a bits perspective. But really today we won't be talking about that. We'll be focusing on really the teams and the organizations and everything that sort of support that, and the strategies that guide everything. So, Ryan, maybe if we kick things off, maybe you can sort of first let's talk about what you're seeing in the market, and what are some of the challenges that many brands and companies are having around orienting to data in the right way.
We've definitely reached a component where, if I even think back 20 years to when I was starting my career, I had this book. It was called One-to-One Marketing. And the idea was that we could use this thing called the internet to market to people on an individualized basis. And, fast forward to today, and, quite frankly, we're getting closer, but we're just not there yet. And, some of that is organizational. So as you mentioned, there's a lot more data being collected. There's a lot more technology available. And in some cases, to be frank, the teams, just haven't caught up with the technology. We can do so much more today than we could do 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And then I think the second thing is that organizations are starting to realize that accurate, reliable, consistent data is actually table stakes for them to do their jobs. They don't really have a mandate necessarily to get there, or they don't know the best path to getting there. And so, for example, from an organizational perspective, oftentimes it's the C team and they're like, hey, we need better data. And we don't really know what that looks like. And hey, you guys go get it. And if the mandate's there, that's great because they have the capacity to go get it. Sometimes we see where it's bubbling up from the bottom, where you have basically somebody on the team that's like, hey, I was at another company and we did this really cool thing with data and we should do it here. And they spend a lot of time and effort and energy trying to explain and sell in and talk to the organization about how to do that better. And so we see it both from the top down and the bottom up, organizationally getting to this place where companies are seeing that they have to get to the next level, and sometimes maybe just don't know how to get there in the organization.
We were talking about, you've seen examples of customers or other folks in the market more broadly, rather, where executives are just a little bit afraid of sort of taking that next step and really taking a data-driven and measured approach. Obviously, from my perspective as a data scientist by trade, these things are always very surprising to hear. But maybe you can talk about really what drives that, and what are some of the fears of adoption at sort of the at the top and sort of the top most strategic levels that you are seeing in the market.
Yeah, I think there's really two fears of adoption. One is that they're going to get it wrong and they're going to get fired for it. And so, that's something that, you can almost always address pretty easily just by, pointing out that the path to success is not nebulous, and that there's a way to get from A to Z, and that we can tell a story that is going to be audited and reliable and consistent and make their jobs easier. The one that's a little bit harder is the fear that the data that's uncovered is going to make them look bad. And so, the general construct is, like, in quotes, like, you're not going to measure me, right? And so to some extent they're measuring today, but it's for example, averages, right? Oh, well, the average number went up. It's like, well, we can do things in cohorts now, and we can look at, for users that signed up in July, are they still members today? And like tell a lot more information about, what's happening with your customer base, for example. And I think, the key to that conversation, where you have somebody that might be uneasy about having, their job being put on a pedestal, if you will, from a data perspective, is to really create a framework within the company and tell the story that no. Now that we can, measure things correctly, it allows us to formulate tests and benchmark and optimize in a way that, might have been more difficult before. And so the key is, you're not going to get fired for having a bad test, right? That's the story you want to tell in the organization. It's that, look, we thought we had a hypothesis, we tried something, it worked or it didn't work, and we're going to continue to iterate and evolve and optimize against that benchmark. And we know the benchmark is real, because that's the other piece is, you say, well, do you have the data you need and believe the data you have? And the answer is almost universally no. And so it's like, okay, well, let's get to that benchmark. And then look, you're not going to lose your job because you didn't have the benchmark before. So now you do, and we can tell a story that shows how much better you're doing on an incremental basis.
Yeah, no, it's very, very interesting. Sort of the story you tell around, calibration and benchmarks. We had a customer who used, some third-party technology to do customer lifetime value predictions. And I think one day a data scientist came and did some analysis and was like, "Hey, I can build more accurate predictions. We don't have to work with an outside vendor." And they did a ton of analysis and a ton of measurement. And they actually realized that yes, like what this this data scientist said was true, and they could actually bring it in house and do the modeling themselves. Fast forward a few months to when the system switched over. The marketing teams were actually very disappointed. Because they were optimizing a CAC to LTV ratio. They had a certain number of dollars they could spend per new customer, and suddenly, one of the things they uncovered is there was a systematic bias around what the average lifetime value was, and it suddenly really just lowered their ability to bid on AdWords and paid advertising, and really gets the dynamics of the entire funnel changed, and it was disruptive.
And was that a good thing for the org or a bad thing? Like, how did they handle that change management?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, look, from my perspective as a data practitioner, it's a good thing because it more accurately reflects reality of business. Now this is where your organizational alignment comes to be important. Because someone in a marketing seat whose goal is to acquire as many customers in a performant way possible. Now they suddenly have a much smaller or relatively smaller margin to actually optimize within. Now, that being said, like for the broader business, this is actually the realities and the physics of the world, but it's a sort of recalibration that no one was expecting.
No, and it's important, in particular on the marketing side. It's easy to measure a conversion rate from a source. Like, oh, it went up or it went down. Looking at, for example, multi-channel attribution, now you're looking at like, oh, wait a minute, what was the impact of this thing? And then you have like deterministic and probabilistic. So you have a data scientist in it saying, well, the probability that it came from a source is X. And a marketer going, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And so, another piece of this is connecting the dots across the silos and, really creating a data dictionary that allows the company to talk about data in a unified way. Like even at the level of what's a sign up, what's a customer, what is LTV? I can't tell you the number of times I've been in a conversation where, 3 people at the table were saying LTV and they meant completely different things. And so as an organization, again, data can be scary because we're asking for and talking about and saying things that isn't even the same language. And so one of the things that we always work on up front in an engagement is talking about, well, let's define what we're going to call it. What is a conversion? What is a sign up? What is a customer? What is revenue, right? And even within revenue, you'd think that'd be so straightforward. And you'll see companies, particularly at size, where one group is measured on GMV, the other one's measured on net, and you have some with sales tax, some without sales tax, and the numbers don't add up. And it becomes, frustrating because ultimately the aggregate reports don't really tell the accurate story. And so culturally, internally, you have to create a language that, allows people to communicate. And that communication takes away some of that fear. It's like, oh, okay, we're all talking about the same thing. Great. I understand when you're asking me for that report, what you're actually asking for. And it doesn't make me defensive because, if I didn't know that, I might have to go talk to 3 people and I don't want to look stupid in the meeting or whatever happens in the org. And so those are things that, we tend to try and address up front.
Yeah, no, we've certainly seen cases on the other side where, where customers, when we first start working with them, have their set of tools on the marketing side that report a certain set of metrics around LTV, around customer acquisition costs, around conversion rates, and then you look on the other side of the fence around analytical capabilities and data capabilities, and it's a different set of numbers. And to your point, Ryan, I think there are 2 challenges here. One is technical and making sure the data comes from the same place, but the other is really just organizational and cultural. Like how exactly do you define these things? Because LTV has real nuance, and there are many ways you can think about any of these metrics, and consistency is key. And and we've seen some of our customers, they might have a product owner or someone from a data team, who sort of owns this specifically, or even a small team that maintains a data dictionary. When you sort of seen examples of customers of yours do a really great jobs around defining what their key metrics are, like what does that look like? And for our listeners today who might have messy data and really don't understand where things are defined, what's your advice on how to have them take the right next step forward?
Well, I think it starts with we always think about it as starting with what are the business questions we're trying to answer, and how is answering those questions going to impact the business? And that's a way for us to prioritize which pieces of all the data you're going to actually go after, right? And so I think there's a couple of different components to that. So one is having the data dictionary, and then one is, you mentioned like collecting the data and having accurate data is table stakes. But if we're collecting the data in the appropriate way, but defining it wrong, then we end up with the same problem. So for example, we had a situation where a pretty big company, 2 teams collecting logins appropriately. It's just that one team was defining logins as every single login, and the other one was like every single unique person that logged in 30 days, right? Wildly divergent numbers.
But both reasonable ways of measuring something conceptually.
That's right. And the same name and a metric that might be reasonable. But the problem is now I have a table somewhere that has a number in it that's a login, and I have a table somewhere else with a number in it that's a login. And if you're a data person and you're just grabbing logins for a report and using them interchangeably, nothing adds up, right? Yeah. And so I think it starts with, why are we, capturing logins? I mean, we're going to capture a login, but how does that tie into a business question that moves the needle on my business? Oh, well, we're looking at, the people that log in at least once a week are more likely to spend 20% more than people that don't. I don't know, right? You have to have a hypothesis. But really what you're doing is you're saying, okay, in the context of our business, what are the questions we're going to answer? What's the data we're going to collect? How do we communicate that in the organization? And that's within the silo. So let's call it marketing or product or sales. But then it's also, how do I create an umbrella conversation across those silos, right? And I think that's another place where companies tend to break down organizationally, because you have, sales worried about closed won, or, some, recurring Stripe payment. And then you have marketing worried about, did they, click the ad and fill out the form? And how do you bind those 2 things together so that you understand in sales what's happening in marketing that's happening in sales, as an example?
Yeah, no, that's great. And maybe we can sort of go a level deeper, into this notion of laddering. you have a KPI or a metric at a certain level, ultimately, it exists for a reason.
Right.
We won't be spending.
Sometimes it's a totally arbitrary.
We can talk about vanity metrics on a different episode.
Yeah,
but ostensibly it's there for good reason. And then at the end of the day, there's business and company goals and OKRs or whatever the vehicle is there to define sort of the business critical KPIs. Maybe you can sort of talk about just when you've sort of seen organizations, deploy metrics effectively, in a top-down fashion or bottom-up for that matter, to really affect alignment across the board. Like, what does that look like, and how do you get to this place of understanding, why do sign-ins matter, and how does it fit in with the broader picture?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, for us, it is an exercise in sort of rigorous definition and communication and consulting. I mean, ultimately, what are the questions you should be asking for your type of business? Are you already asking them, and do you have the data or not? And so I think that part of that is, if we have a mechanism like Simon, we can use something to tie everything together, and we can tell that story in a very auditable and rigorous way, where everybody believes the data. And I think believing the data is actually a really strong component to this, because you'll see at many companies that, maybe get data from GA and maybe get data from Shopify, maybe get data from Stripe. Nobody actually believes, quote, the data. They believe some like directional, opportunities, like, oh, we sold this much stuff in this bucket. So for example, let's say I have Stripe and PayPal and invoices, okay? Like, companies actually don't add up that data well, right? So you need a mechanism for it's like, okay, well, this is our revenue and it's defined and we can all talk about it the same way. And it kind of keeps coming back to the same theme, which is like, I believe what I'm seeing and it passes the sniff test. Because I think what you end up with in meetings where people don't feel confident in the data, there is a little bit of this like, it doesn't quite smell right. It doesn't quite look right. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that, at a most foundational level, everybody is in the room is like actually talking about the data and not talking about how they're feeling about the data. And, that's a big distinction.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And ultimately, look, these things, in many cases ladder up very neatly to each other. You can relate sign-ins with registrations and conversions in a way that can capture every single user who visits your site. And if the goal, depending on what your goals are, you can focus on one or the other accordingly. Maybe we can sort of transition topics and talk about testing. As a data scientist by trade, when I look at attribution, it's sort of like you're looking in the back. You're looking at what happened over the last 30 days, 3 hours, whatever the window might be. You're making some inferences, maybe doing something fancy, with multi-touch attribution, or most likely you're not. But you're really just making some very specific assumptions around what may have caused a user or a customer to take a specific action. Testing is a much more controlled environment, of course, with an A/B test, or there are many other more sophisticated ways of executing a test. But maybe you can talk about testing best practices and really just what are some of the challenges that so many folks have in deploying their tests within their marketing strategies or more broadly.
I think people err on the side of minutia in testing when there are massive low-hanging fruit that can be picked, usually, right? So I'll never forget, we went into a company and they had this is pre-COVID, and we showed up at the office and there was this giant conference room of the biggest button color test schematic you've ever seen. It was like, we're gonna test every button color on every page and every site. And, there were obviously 30 or 40 other things you could test much more easily than this, button color test, which probably wasn't gonna move the needle that much. And so we're always like, what's the biggest lever? What are we gonna test? So for example, email is one of the greatest things ever. If I can increase my conversion rate on an email by a little bit, I probably make a lot of money. So let's go do that, right? Are we segmenting properly? So let's not create 27 segments on our first test. Let's create one, right? And see how far we can push it, and how far we can push that, and how far can we push the next one. And so I think the biggest takeaway is, look for the big levers. Don't try and do everything at once. Make sure you have enough sample. It's a huge problem in testing. It's like, oh, well, we had 2 users and half of them went to A and half of them went to B. So it's, inconclusive. It's like, yeah, but you only had 2 users, right? And it's usually not 2. It's literally usually 200, right? And so you're like, okay, well, you've got 20 million users on your site and you have 200 people that have seen this thing. We're not there yet. And so I think, I'm probably like just sort of munging a bunch of things together that I see all the time. But if you look at it, it's like, don't test tiny things. Don't test small sample sizes, right? Test things where you have the biggest lever. So if I can move the needle on revenue or signups or, whatever that, key metric is, do that first and focus on it and make it better, because every time you push it a little bit more, it's going to compound and ultimately result in net conversion funnel differences that impact your business.
Yeah. And I always say, if you're at a place where you're really antagonizing to see whether or not, an experiment you ran, drove real lift. It's not that you shouldn't spend the time trying to figure out what happened, but if you take a step back from the situation, the answer more times than not is that, the change really isn't that impactful. Right. I think for so many businesses, if you're running tests and the result is something that requires, a tremendous amount of sort of statistical analysis to understand if there's lift, you might want to take a step back and reevaluate your strategy. Even Google, I think they ran this, famous or infamous test, depending on how you look at it, where they ran like 32 gradations of like blue to green or something to understand what people clicked on the most. Of course, there was one variation that got clicked on the most. And of course, someone backed out that it got Google however many more millions of dollars a year. Again, taking a step back, I can't imagine that Google couldn't have found other ways of creating a more value additive or more a more sort of transformative strategic way of looking at how they could have improved the ad experience outside of the background of the color.
But remember, we're not Google and we don't have infinite sample.
Exactly.
The vast majority that's saying if Google did it, that doesn't mean you can do it.
And I would argue, I don't think Google should have done it. Because as many engineers as they have and as many people as they have, I spent 4 years of my career building ad tech platforms. I guess now there are many things they could be doing instead, that are more disruptive, and can really drive more value on both sides of their ad market.
Well, we're still talking about it.
We're still talking about it. Well, learn from our mistakes.
Something worked.
Great. And then really just sort of underscoring your point, Ryan, around look, all good experimentation comes from a strategy, from a thesis.
Totally.
The root of the scientific method, starts with a thesis around what's going on with your control group and your test group. And this is, very, very sort of, basic and well understood, branch of science. Yet, for so many folks applying the basics, they sort of miss the boat around, hey, what do you actually think, is happening, and what's your take on how the consumer is ultimately responding to whatever you're trying to understand?
I think the biggest change that I've seen in this area is a misunderstanding between cohorts and averages. So, I think historically, again, marketers in particular have only had access to average data. And as a result, it's like, well, the average went up or the average went down. And as soon as you're able to put something into a cohort and start segmenting it smartly, it changes the conversation almost completely, right? Because now let's just say, we're going to take the most basic thing, male, female. Okay. We're selling something, we have men's shoes and women's shoes. And I want to make sure that if you clicked an ad from a women's shoe, it goes to a women's shoe landing page and vice versa. Right. Okay. It seems obvious. It's not an average though. The conversion rate for women and men in those segments might be different. And you can do that across many different areas. And so I think the thing that we focus on the most there as we, talk about data is very rarely are we going to use an average as a benchmark or something that we can point at. It's going to be in a cohort. It's going to be for a specific user segment. It's going to be in a very specific, period of time, right? And it gives us a way to structure that information so that everybody kind of understands what the underlying levers are, because in an average you don't. And that's been a big evolution in teams that I've seen over the last few years. I mean, honestly, when I started Mammoth, if I said a cohort to somebody, they didn't know what I was talking about in data. Now it's 75% do, 25% we're still getting into the whiteboard and drawing a little graph and doing a histogram and going this is what we're talking about. And they go, oh, wow, that's amazing. And so we really, really drill down on that and drive the point home where we can.
Yeah, and getting back to the where we started the conversation around metrics and definitions of core stats for the business. Look, if you had a big app upgrade, where you knew there was going to be a change in installs or user behavior, that's sort of another way of slicing your metrics and really reconsidering how you measure things. Cohorts is the most standard example that spans across time. But at the end of the day, you need to really you need to ask the question: am I comparing apples to apples? Or do these two numbers have fundamentally different qualities that are just incomparable?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's interesting is that the tools get better and better and better at providing that information more readily. So, as a marketer, if you're starting to think about how to segment and how to cohort, like Simon, enterprise class tool, right? We do so much cool stuff with it. And so I think fundamentally giving the marketer the power to take advantage of that today, where we can measure it properly, we can segment it properly, we can send it properly. Those are all things that just, provide additional levers for these marketers to do the things they were guessing about before. And I think that that's another underlying theme, which is, we were talking about measuring people that didn't want to be measured. It's not that they kind of didn't want to be measured, it's just they didn't know how to do it well. And so, we've got our dashboard of raw log data that doesn't tell us that much, but the log data went up to the right and it's fine. Just that thing needs to go up into the right and I'm fine. And what you realize is but only half of it's going up into the right, or maybe like a little less than half. So if we took the part that was crushing it, it was really like straight up. And then there's another part that's kind of like flat to down. And you're not seeing that in the average. And so, peeling those layers of the onion apart is what allows these teams to just get better and better and better at what they do, if they're following that sort of scientific method that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, 100%. So we're approaching to the end of our time. Yeah, so maybe we'll move on and wrap. And first, Ryan, thank you for coming on the podcast today and sharing your wisdom with us. When I sort of really reflect on the broader conversation that we've had, the ability to be data driven ultimately starts with your strategy, and the people who are in the seats to execute against it. Metric alignment, really making sure that the analytical underpinnings around understanding what the data actually means. Really are only as good as the technical capabilities to support it all. From everything from cross experimentation, to how you think about deploying that into the customer lifecycle and into all of your marketing campaigns. If you don't have the right North Star in place with the right goals, and if you don't have the right set of supporting metrics that allow your team and your organization to align with each other against a common set of goals, you're at a very difficult place. And folks like Mammoth Growth, really just do a fantastic job of working hand in hand across both technical and business stakeholders, to deploy both the 101s around the infrastructure and analytical capabilities, and then make sure that they can oversee that they can be deployed in a very effective way to drive your real marketing and customer experience outcomes. So with that, Ryan, maybe you can tell our listeners a bit more about how they can learn more about Mammoth Data.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, mammothgrowth.com would be the best place to check us out. And I think, fundamentally, as a business, we've helped, hundreds of companies get to accurate, reliable, consistent data across their stack and do something with it. That's everything from in-tool down to, building warehouses and doing BI in a visualization tool. And so excited to work with Simon and work with a number of great mutual customers. And, everybody has a data problem and we're here to solve it.
Great. And thank you, Ryan. And thank you, everyone else who's listening to this episode of the Data Unlock podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about Simon Data, please visit us on the web at simondata.com or email us at hello@simondata.com.